Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's launch of the IDS Bulletin, Graduating from Social Protection, ? Welcome to everyone who's here, but also a special welcome to everyone who's joining us online. You can follow the discussion on Twitter with the hashtag social protection and the handle @ODIDev. So we look forward to receiving your comments throughout, and during the Q&A, we can also read out questions to the speakers that come through online. So graduation is a fairly recent concept and was pioneered in Bangladesh, and there have been some very impressive success stories of how graduation programs, through a combination of different interventions, both like training and asset transfers, as well as access to microfinance, have actually managed to pull people out of poverty. But there's still a lot of questions related to how exactly we define graduation, what it means, how it looks like, how different programs implement it, and whether it actually works in different contexts. So the IDS Bulletin combines a range of papers looking both at how graduation is conceptualized across contexts, as well as how it is operationalized. And it looks at both small-scale NGO-led pilots, as well as larger-scale programs, like, for example, the productive safety net programs in Rwanda and Ethiopia. So it gives quite a breadth of experience in terms of what is actually out there. And it also asks some questions about operational challenges of putting it into practice. You will hear more about that from our 5 speakers today. And it is a pleasure to introduce, first of all, the co-editors of the bulletin, Stephen Devereux and Rachel Sabatis-Wheeler. Both are fellows at IDS, and Stephen is the director of Center for Social Protection, and he works mainly on issues around food security, social protection, and rural livelihoods in Africa. Rachel has been a research fellow at IDS since 2001, with occasional secondments to UNICEF and Rwanda most lately, but now coming back to IDS. And she has worked on poverty and vulnerability analysis, graduation, targeting, and also several social protection issues. So over to you, Stephen and Rachel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming, taking time out of your day, and thank you for those online. Thank you for ODI for hosting us and contributing quite substantially to the bulletin. So we're delighted to launch the bulletin, and we have a few copies here, but it will become open access at some point, the bulletin itself, later, I think, beginning of next year. In the bulletin, we have a few clusters of areas that we look at: conceptual, empirical, and operational. And typically in development, social protection discourse, graduation means leaving a program, participants or households leaving a program after reaching a predefined threshold. So once a participant or a beneficiary or a recipient, however you like to call it, has acquired a set of skills or resources that is expected to equip them with a higher income future livelihood. So some kind of potential that over time they will move into a resilient type of livelihood. There's that threshold, and graduation often means that is when they leave the program. So I'm going to just bring us all up to speed. I'm sure we've all seen diagrams like this before about what we mean conceptually by graduation. And then Stephen and I will have a little banter to highlight some of the issues in the bulletin. So here we have a theory, the theory of change really behind graduation models. And on our vertical axis, we have a measurement of poverty. Here it's assets. It could be income, it could be nutrition, it could be something, well-being of some kind. And that line across the middle would be a threshold or some critical point that you think, above which someone you would think they're off this program. They're no longer what we would consider eligible or poor or extremely poor. And below that, you would think, well, they're actually deserving of some kind of support, and they're poor. So if you think of somebody right down at the bottom of this curve, which actually the curve represents a livelihood trajectory, a hypothetical one that you would hope somebody or a household would, over time, accumulate assets and move up. But someone right at the bottom would be extremely poor, very little assets, and you might want to, you say, okay, they're eligible for this program, we're going to give them some livestock or some cash. And over time, you would hope they'd move along that asset accumulation curve. There's some theories, mainly coming out of the States, at least 8 years ago, from Michael Carter and Christopher Barrett, that talk about a critical point, that threshold, below which, if people haven't reached it, they will fall back into a poverty trap. So there's kind of a disaccumulation going on if you don't give people that exact right amount. And above it, there's a virtuous sort of cycle of dynamic accumulation. And there have been some studies on that we can talk about if you're interested. But anyway, so that threshold is what we're thinking about typically in graduation programs, and particularly when you think about resources and programmers. They say, okay, when a beneficiary hits that threshold, they exit the program, they're off the program. So the VUP, the PSMP, different types of programs. So that's very sort of important for programmatic purposes and also for the amount of resources you have to go around for the people below that line. But there's also another kind of graduation. Sorry. Oh, sorry, going back. Why did that skip? That Stephen and I have also published on a few years ago, where we distinguish between the threshold graduation and sustainable graduation, essentially making the distinction between moving off a specific program, like yesterday you were eligible, today you're not eligible because you've now got another goat, to an issue of how you ensure people stay off that program and become resilient over time. So there's no point today coming off a program if next week you have a shock and you need their support again. So it's ensuring that we're also able to think about the duration, the time frame in which people become resilient and able to move into positive trajectories of change in terms of their livelihoods. So there's two types of graduation that we distinguish in the bulletin. Okay, so there's many different programs across the world that use this theory of change to develop very specific instruments in their graduation model programs. And these programs tend to have a common logic and often very similar design features. So typically the programs will identify extremely poor people, and they will sequence a package of support, starting with consumption support, which might be in the form of cash transfers or food transfers, then some assets, maybe providing people with small productive assets, livestock, maybe large ones, cows, then trying to encourage credit access and provision and savings, and then also providing intensive training and coaching around the use of assets and cash. So that's your typical sequencing in graduation model programs. So here's one program that is very famous this is the theory underpinning the BRAC, Challenging the Frontiers of Poverty Reduction, targeting the ultra-poor program in Bangladesh. And I think Martina already said Bangladesh pioneered this graduation model program. So at the beginning, in terms of the time down here, the program selects beneficiaries, very poor ones, clients, they're called here, which are in the extreme poverty category, below the poverty line, the extreme poverty line. And then they will provide consumption support in the form of cash, savings services, and then as the clients or the households become better off, they'll move them into skills training and encourage them to take credits. Right? I think people are familiar with this. And I'm pointing this out simply because it's indicative of many other programs, the same theory, the productive safety net in Ethiopia that we talk about, the Rwandan Vision 2020 and Murenge program. Many, many, many different programs use this. So this is just to help us get on the same page in terms of what we're talking about here, what the bulletin is covering. And now I think we'll move over to you.
So graduation programs have generated a lot of excitement, and there's lots of discussion around them. They are, in a sense, the new hot topic in social protection programming. And so here's a little scenario where two NGO workers are sitting in a bar discussing graduation. And one of them is very keen on graduation, and he's called the graduator. Another one's a bit skeptical, and she's called Ms. Wright, and she's wondering whether graduation programs are incompatible with, say, a rights-based approach to social protection programming. So I think you might be able to guess who's the graduator and who's Ms. Wright in this case. Okay. So we all want to get people out of poverty, don't we? So graduation model programs are the new big idea for doing this.
Really? How do they work?
It's quite simple, actually. You find the poorest households in the village, you give them some livelihood support and special attention for a couple of years, and hey presto, they graduate out of poverty.
Just like that? And they're no longer poor?
Okay, they're still poor, but they are moderately poor. They're no longer extremely poor.
So what does graduation actually mean? Graduating out of one definition of poverty into another definition of poverty?
That's too cynical. It means graduation out of extreme poverty. Hundreds of thousands of people in Bangladesh, for example.
Oh, sounds expensive.
Yeah, it's not cheap. You have to give them some cash every month for a couple of years. You have to give them an asset like a cow that generates flows of income. You have to give them some training and access to savings.
Well, that sounds very expensive.
Yeah, okay. So in India, for example, the program costs around $500 per participant.
$500 for hundreds of thousands of people. How many governments can afford that?
Yeah, but you have to think of it as an investment in poverty reduction.
Well, if it has positive impacts on poor people, that probably justifies the expense. Though I wonder how cost-effective graduation programs are compared to other cheaper interventions.
Yeah, cheaper maybe, but less effective. How many success stories do you know of where people get out of poverty thanks to a development project? Anyway, what's worse, giving poor people the means to make a living or leaving them in poverty and dependent on handouts like food aid for indefinitely?
Okay, I see the logic. Teaching a man to fish or maybe giving a woman microcredit to sell fish. But isn't there a risk that giving all these goodies to people for free will make them dependent on the program? Why would they bother to work if they know they can rely on handouts from the state?
On the contrary, the whole point is to break dependency syndrome, not to create it. It's about giving people the tools they need to help themselves.
But you often hear stories about unemployed men drinking away their welfare money, or teenage girls deliberately getting pregnant to get child grants, or even parents keeping their babies malnourished to stay eligible for support from the state.
Anecdotes are not evidence. Of course there are cases of abuse, but there are no rigorous studies proving that this happens on any large scale. We hear these stories because the media loves bad news. The fact is most social protection beneficiaries are good news stories, so they don't get reported.
And you're saying that graduation programs are different because they don't keep giving support indefinitely. They actually aim to get people out of the program as quickly as possible.
Exactly. Once participants get onto the graduation pathway, you can leave them to their own devices and they'll be fine. They get self-reliant and resilient livelihoods. You no longer have to spend any public money on them.
That sounds like an excuse for governments to abandon their poor citizens. Help them out for a while and then it's goodbye and good luck. You're on your own now. Isn't social protection supposed to be a right?
People like you often get this confused. Everyone has a right to social protection when they need it. That's not the same as saying that everybody has a right to get free cash from their government. Like the social protection flaw says, everyone has a right to income security, not to free income.
Now you're splitting hairs. What's the difference?
All the difference in the world. If you have enough income, you don't need free social assistance from the state. If you have a private pension or enough savings for your retirement, you don't need subsidized social insurance.
So what if your graduates fall back into extreme poverty again? What happens then?
Well, most of them don't. It's quite remarkable. Surveys done 2 years after support from the program's end find that most graduates stay at the income they achieved at graduation, and many keep improving. Very few fell back.
But what about those that did fall back? Isn't the whole point of social protection to guarantee a safety net precisely for such situations?
That's a fair point. These programs tend to be a one-way door, so once you're out, you're out. But some programs do regular retargeting, so you could, in theory, go through the revolving door every year.
Anyway, what about children? How do these graduation programs help them?
Well, obviously, if you're a child in a family benefiting from these programs and the family gets better off, the child will be better off also.
And what about the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia?
The PSNP, what about it?
The PSNP tries to graduate poor rural families out of food insecurity by offering employment on public works projects to men and women and asset packages that promote secondary livelihood activities. What do you think happened to children's well-being in these families?
As you know, I believe in graduation programs, so I have to assume that household incomes increased, so school attendance increased and child labour decreased.
But it's not that straightforward. You have to disaggregate the children by age and cohort and sex. Boys and older girls benefited by working fewer hours, but girls aged 6 to 10 had to do more work and they went to school less often.
And how do we explain that?
Probably the girls had to stay at home and look after their younger siblings while their mother was out doing public works and other livelihood activities.
So now you're arguing that women should stay at home and look after the children. That's not very progressive, Ms. Wright.
Not at all. I'm not arguing that at all. We just need to make livelihood programs more gender sensitive and child sensitive, for example, by providing childcare support for working mothers.
Even so, it is worrying that there are these trade-offs.
Yes, and it has led some people to argue that graduation programs focus too much on achieving short-term improvements and not enough on transforming lives and livelihoods in a sustainable way.
How do you mean?
Surely the real test for graduation is whether children grow up less poor than their parents, which means investing in their development, not creating incentives for their parents to take them out of school. Graduation isn't truly successful until it's sustainable in the long term.
Okay, let's agree on that then. Graduation for all. Long may it last. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rachel and Stephen. I think that was a very good introduction to just showing that it's not quite that simple and that there are a lot of different views on it, particularly in terms of like what the objective of social protection should be, particularly in relation to graduation. And a great introduction for the next panelists as well, and I think we will touch on quite a few of those issues in the next presentations. Our next speaker is Vishal Gaddavi, a consultant at ITAT in the Social Protection and Rural Livelihoods Programme. He has extensive experience in rural livelihoods and social protection programming, particularly with a very innovative focus on real-time mobile phone-based monitoring systems, which he will be talking more about. Vishal, go.
Thank you. So I'll be talking about experience from Bangladesh from a large livelihoods and asset transfer program that I used to work at called the Economic Empowerment of the Poorest, or as it was more widely known in Bangladesh, Shiri. Shiri was funded by two donors, primarily DFID, but also SDC, and also the government of Bangladesh. And I'll be talking about how we try to essentially operationalize the concept of graduation in the program. And we did this by using real-time monitoring tools to enhance graduation from extreme poverty. So taking a quick step back, I think this is quite important. I mean, the challenge of the post-MDG agenda, as I'm sure you're all very well versed in, one of the agendas is this leave no one behind. You hear this a lot, leave no one behind, which also means the total eradication of extreme poverty. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, can the complete eradication of extreme poverty actually and practically be achieved? Now, many transformative livelihoods programs similar to Shiri typically state anywhere between 60 to 90% graduation, leaving aside for a minute, the issue of sustainability, which is in itself a very important issue. So then you have to ask, well, you can't seriously eradicate extreme poverty if you're therefore then leaving behind a percentage of people who are written off from these programs. They're essentially non-graduates that fail to graduate out of extreme poverty. So given the scale and the complexity of the challenge, how can we practically realize getting to this ambition of 0% extreme poverty, or in other words, leaving no one behind? To talk about Bangladesh, there are around 26 million people living in extreme poverty in Bangladesh. And the experiences borne by those people living in extreme poverty is extremely diverse, both within the same parts of the country as well as different parts of the country, as well as demographically. Each family and household will have different features and different obstacles that they have to overcome in order to escape extreme poverty. So take, for example, a family living in an urban informal settlement or a slum in Dhaka, in the capital city. They'll face a completely different set of circumstances than, say, historically marginalized tribal families living in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, which is an isolated southern east in the southeast corner of the country. So the phenomenon of extreme poverty is in itself extremely diverse, but so too are the challenges and the obstacles that families within extreme poverty face to escape extreme poverty. So going back to Shiri, the program, the word Shiri in Bangla literally means steps. So I guess the term Shiri for the program can try to encapsulate this idea of steps out of poverty. At least that's how we pitched it to the government and other stakeholders there. But Shiri itself is a challenge fund primarily, and as a challenge fund, it was a transformative livelihoods program. And by the end of the program lifespan, and it's still continuing, there are around 300,000 beneficiary households enrolled into the program, and within sub-projects, implemented by partner NGOs across the length and breadth of Bangladesh. And as far as graduation is concerned, during the early days of the program, graduation was not an explicit objective of the program. It was never in the language of the program, and neither from DFID, the donor, or the government of Bangladesh. But later it did become a requirement for the program. So in other words, we had to report on the figures, or rather the number of beneficiaries, percentage of beneficiaries in the program that are graduating out of extreme poverty. So in the context of Shiri at least, graduation actually refers to the transition of households out of extreme poverty. So as an asset transfer program, beneficiaries, once they're enrolled into the program, would receive an income-generating asset of some type, be that a cow, a rickshaw, a small business, enterprise. There's a vast list of these different types of assets, and the beneficiaries would choose which type of asset that they would like and what would be appropriate for them, given their specific circumstances. And in addition to the assets, there would also be provided skills training and mentoring for a period of typically up to around 3 years. And then within Shiri and the sub-projects, we had a common monitoring system. So this diagram shows a typical project-stipulated graduation pathway. Essentially, as Rachel was talking about, theory of change of graduation, how once beneficiaries are on these projects, how they transition out of extreme poverty. And the model essentially says that once these beneficiaries have been selected onto the program, they're then given some immediate cash or other forms of support. And then once they've been transferred the asset based on what they actually would like to do and what they can engage with, over that period of time, up to around 3 years, they're also provided training and mentoring support. And in that time frame, the theory is that they will accumulate assets, accumulate savings, reinvest that back into the household, and are essentially on this upward trajectory out of extreme poverty. And once they reach this graduation threshold, whereby they've attained food security and ticked off a bunch of other indicators that then says that they are no longer extremely poor, they have graduated out of extreme poverty. So above this line, they are no longer deemed to be extremely poor. But experience shows that graduation is rarely, if ever it is, a straightforward linear path. One of Shiri's qualitative monitoring tools shows that a lot of households who are otherwise on an upward trajectory, on this upward trajectory path out of extreme poverty, face setbacks and shocks that actually then thrust them back down into a state of extreme poverty. Now, kind of obvious examples are floods or cyclones that may affect entire villages. Homesteads will be eroded and washed away, all the assets will be washed away, and then of course villages, the people living in these villages will be devastated by such climatic shocks. But there are also less obvious examples. For example, chronic illness. If the main income earner in a household falls chronically ill, and given that the health facilities in rural Bangladesh particularly are not very good, in order to pay for treatment, they may need to sell their assets in a distressed sale, or they may no longer be able to engage with their asset in the way that they had been prior to the illness, or they may no longer be able to work. And that might also then thrust that family back down into a state of extreme poverty. So there are many examples of these types of shocks and hazards, which can actually then bring back down that household in a state of extreme poverty when they were otherwise accumulating the assets and on this upward path. So graduation at Shiri, well, we did actually have a graduation index, and it was a multidimensional index that we created to report on graduation using a sample survey, and this was conducted every year. This was primarily for reporting to the government of Bangladesh as well as our donor. But then within the program, we thought that graduation is actually much more valuable as an operational concept. If we could operationalize the idea of graduation, we thought it would be much more helpful for us to enhance graduation. So how can we enhance graduation? How can we get to this 100% graduation, as lofty as a goal that might be? And then we thought about, well, it's necessary to then know the condition of all of your households on a much more frequent basis. And that got us to thinking about developing a system whereby we could know the poverty status of all of our beneficiaries on a census level and on a much more updated frequency. And to that end, we developed a tool that used a combination of smartphones, internet, visualization dashboard that brought all this data and information together for use as a management information system in order to then be able to investigate and provide supplementary support to those households who we could then identify as struggling or not on this upward path to graduation, or even identify problematic areas. And then what would happen is that the NGOs would then visit and follow up these suspected cases to understand the causes. So the system in itself is obviously not designed to tell you why this household or these groups of people are not faring very well, but at the very least it could pinpoint us to particular areas. And then it was up to the NGOs and the field staff to then go and have a face-to-face consultation and understand the causes. So it wasn't a substitute for the face-to-face interaction, which is still very important to these types of graduation programs. And therefore, if once we'd find out these causes, if there are indeed any, we would then be able to provide some additional targeted support, be that financial, whether it's the transfer of another asset or a group of supplementary assets, or non-financial support as well. So it could just be extra mentoring or training support. It could be linkages to other forms of government support, linkages to health facilities, or even linkages to other forms of employment. So essentially, we were trying to optimize resources within the program and focus on those who needed the most attention. So I'll just finish off and leave you with some final thoughts. If the leave no one behind mantra is to be taken seriously, I mean, in addition to the huge resources, both economic and political, it does actually require practical means to realize this ambition. And despite the arbitrariness of any graduation threshold, I mean, the concept still provides operational usefulness. So despite some of the conceptual as well as analytical issues of graduation and having a graduation line, where do you put that? What bundle of indicators do you use to construct that line? Even something like $1.25, it's still an arbitrary line. It's a one-size-fits-all type of line. Whatever the issues and problems with that, leaving that aside, it does provide operational usefulness, because once you set a line, then you can focus as practitioners and programmers, you can then focus your attention on all those beneath the line and then provide the assistance to those people beneath that particular given threshold. And I'll just finish off by saying that not all households do successfully graduate out of extreme poverty, and may need continual social protection support of some form. Programs like Shiri and other programs similar to Shiri in Bangladesh, these asset transfer programs, may not indeed be appropriate for all of its beneficiaries. I mean, there are many beneficiaries who are the poorest of the poor, chronically poor, and unable to engage in this type of program that many other households can actually engage. And for those types of households, this type of program may not necessarily be the most appropriate. And in fact, as I say, continual social protection support in some other form may actually be needed, perhaps even for the rest of their lives in some cases. And I think I'll leave it there.
Great, Shal, thank you very much. I pass over to Katie, the next speaker. Katie Rowland is a research fellow at IDS, and she's also the co-director of the Centre for Social Protection. And her work focuses on social protection poverty, and especially linkages between social protection and child protection. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pick up on some of the issues that Mr. Graduator and Ms. Wright have flagged. And I'm going to argue that we should think about intergenerational graduation when we want to talk about graduation being really sustainable. So I'm going to pick up on the framework that Rachel showed us to begin with, which shows the process of disaccumulation, but mostly dynamic accumulation of assets, which should lead to sustainable graduation. So up to the line is threshold graduation, and then over and above, over a certain period of time, should lead to a sustainable pathway out of poverty. But the time frame that we are using to consider graduation to be sustainable is actually quite short. So here at the red dotted line, it's about maybe 4 or 5 years, which is also the time frame that Fischel was referring to. So often program support is maybe 2 to 3 years. Some of the evidence that we have that Mr. Graduator referred to looks at what happened after maybe 4 or 5 years. But that's about the time frame that we're considering. And I'm wondering whether that is enough to say graduation has actually happened in a sustainable way. Particularly because the big push towards the threshold to bring households over and above might create some investment traps. Investment traps following limited amount of resources, both within households as well as on behalf of those implementing and funding the programs, that in the long run may undermine this positive pathway, cause households to drop back down, and need a process of re-graduation, if you will. So of course there are the shocks, as Vishal mentioned, but even without those shocks, I think there are processes there that really may undermine the sustainability. Now, what do I mean when I talk about investment traps? I think there are two sides of the coin there. So on the one hand, in households, there's resources, monetary resources or asset resources, as well as productive capacity that needs to be fed into graduation programs for households to move up, to have asset accumulation, to build livelihoods. But arguably, these are the same resources that you would need to invest in children and to ensure child well-being and care. And obviously, if we're talking about sustainable processes and long-term improvements in people's lives, investing in children, making sure that they grow up to be productive adults, if you will, that's key. But now the big push as part of graduation programs may mean that some of these resources do not go to the children. Not only that, as we heard Ms. Wright say, sometimes children are being asked to be a productive part of those graduation programs. So if you've been given livestock or if you invest in livestock, someone has to look after that. And if that's the adult, not the child itself, then someone may have to look after the younger siblings. So for households with children, being part of a graduation program might actually present quite a tricky situation and undermine some of that sustainability, particularly in the long run. Now, there's also an investment trap from the implementation side, whether that's government or NGOs. Again, there's a limited set of resources, mostly monetary resources, also human capacity, that are feeding into these graduation programs. It's all about the big push. But as we heard mentioned as well, people need essential services with respect to children. That would be education and health, but also other infrastructure or maybe other programs in case a shock occurs, or microcredit programs for people to stay on that upward path to make sure that sustainability takes place. And again, the limited resources and the big investment in graduation programs may undermine that and present a trap. So coming back to the other picture then, I'm wondering whether we shouldn't be talking more about intergenerational graduation and actually look at a really longer term perspective and expand our time horizon. Not arguing that graduation programs should necessarily be longer, so that people should stay on the program 10 or 15 or 20 years, but rather by taking into account these things that happen in the long term, we can make sure that programs include investments in services, but also recognize that households with children need to make investments in children and have a limited resource base to do that. And so we heard childcare services mentioned, for example, but also if you have more children, you need more resources to afford their basic needs. And just that recognition may make sure that we don't see this downward fall later on. It might mean that households may take a little bit longer to reach the thresholds. But as the green line shows, that might be more sustainable and actually hold across generations and lead to intergenerational graduation. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much, Katie. I think definitely a new perspective of graduation, of looking at it as a graduation of the whole household, and what does it actually imply for other members within the household, and how can we actually achieve intergenerational graduation. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Anna McCourt. Anna is a research associate in the social protection program here at ODI, and she specializes in social protection program design and evaluation, with a particular interest in program impact at the household level, and she's worked also extensively on public works programs. Anna.
Thank you. I'm going to present a paper that was written jointly by myself and Rachel Slater, also of the Social Protection Programme here at ODI. And it's based on some research that was funded by DFAT, the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade. And what we're going to look at, what this paper looks at, is the relationship between social protection, graduation, and sustainable employment. Because employment is actually one of the key mechanisms within the theory of change by which people are anticipated to graduate through their participation in the programme. But before I start, I wanted to make a point of differentiation, because I think we've heard about graduation programmes, the BRAC model, the asset transfer model. And in fact, that's one set of interventions. But there's a lot of social protection programmes which have graduation objectives. So they're not actually graduation programmes. But around the world, you have social protection programmes which have taken some of these ideas and some of these aspirations. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, the extent to which we can relate the graduation idea to conventional social protection programmes. And the difference is that most social protection programmes don't have the individualised support element. They don't have that intensive element of support with the degree of integration with other programmes that you see in the graduation model. But nonetheless, across both the graduation model and regular social protection programmes, what you see is that employment is really identified as this key vector of graduation, either through self-employment or through some kind of employment, either formal or informal. And the relationship between social protection and employment is quite interesting. Essentially, it attempts to address supply-side constraints to employment by promoting employability. And the way it tries to do this is by promoting skills development. We heard about training programs, often by giving work experience or by helping people to have resources so that they can overcome capital constraints. So, for example, money for job search activities, paying for somebody to look after children while they go out and look for employment. So, primarily, social protection aims to address these kind of supply-side constraints. In some respects, it tries to address demand-side constraints. For example, public works programs, PWPs, they try to actually create additional employment, so they're addressing that demand side. And the other thing that we've seen that social protection programs try and do is to reduce adverse labour market incorporation. And what I mean there is employment in low wage kind of, on low terms of low wages with poor conditions. And essentially, in most developing contexts, we're talking about people working in the bottom segment of the agricultural casual wage labour market. If you look globally at the kind of global labour market, they're the ones right at the bottom working on a daily basis in the agricultural sector. And so one thing that we see that social protection can achieve is to help to reduce this kind of adverse incorporation. But essentially, there's really very much a focus on the supply side constraints in the labour market. And the common goal that you see throughout graduation programmes is an attempt to positively incorporate beneficiaries into the labour market. And when I talk about self-employment or employment, I mean things like micro-enterprise. The main kind of self-employment that you see arising from these programmes is really micro-enterprise, very small-scale enterprise. And there's much less focus on demand-side constraints to employment. And the real point that Rachel and I wanted to make is that this conception of how social protection can address employment is problematic, because if you look at the realities of the labour market in many developing countries, it's got some very particular characteristics. One is they're characterised by surplus labour, a massive supply of low and unskilled labour, unemployment. The other is that they're characterised by underemployment, and here I mean the working poor. And the working poor suffer from either insufficient work or insufficient remuneration for the work that they do. And so the problem isn't just one of unemployment, it's also underemployment and the way in which the poor are incorporated into the labour market. And a lot of the literature talks about the need for inclusion. But in fact, the main labour market challenge is the terms of inclusion. Most of the world's poor are actually included in the labour market in one way or another, but the terms of their inclusion are quite adverse. So let me tell you a little bit more about this situation, give you a little bit more detail about the global labour demand context, and then I'll bring it back to social protection. Some recent work by the ILO showed that actually 2/3 of those who are employed in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are poor, and 42% of workers in sub-Saharan Africa are among the extreme poor. So these people are actually working, they're incorporated into the labour market, but the remuneration is such that they're in the extreme poor category. And despite the kind of growth that we're seeing in low and middle income countries, employment creation is actually quite limited and typically is of poor quality. The kinds of jobs which are being created are low productivity jobs with low wage, they're insecure and they're temporary. And the overwhelming development model that we've used over the last number of decades is that actually there will be a structural transformation whereby agricultural labour will shift into higher return sectors. But what we're seeing is this is happening extremely slowly, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, much more slowly than had been anticipated. And so for the coming decades, we can see that most people are going to be stuck in these poor quality, low wage, low productivity kind of jobs. So the challenge that we're looking to overcome when we're talking about graduation, it's not only unemployment, but it's also this question of the quality of employment that people have and the adverse nature of much labour market incorporation. And I think this is really where the fundamental challenge to the ideas underlying graduation come into play, because the cause of this situation isn't individual agency and individual effort. It's very much the structure of national, regional and global economies and their integration, which is, of course, increasing and has increased significantly over recent decades. So this is really the challenge. Is poverty something which can be overcome on an individual basis, or is it actually more related to structural factors? And I think what we can see is that the main barrier to adequate employment, which would enable people to graduate out of poverty, is in fact structural. It's due to demand-side challenges. So when we're looking at how one can really address these issues in the long term, and also on a large scale, you're really looking at domestic, regional, and international economic and labour policies. And here the kind of initiative of the ILO, the Decent Work initiative, comes into play. So the question is, what's the role of social protection within this? To what extent can social protection really promote graduation in terms of labour market engagement? And one area is obviously the provision of social protection for the working poor. But what's very interesting is that particularly in low-income countries, most social protection provision explicitly excludes the working-age poor by definition. It's often targeted at households which don't have working-age members. It's targeted at households which have low labour availability and have members who belong to particular marginalised groups. And the social protection which is available is highly rationed. So it's highly rationed and it's not targeted at the working-age poor. So there's clearly a bit of a conundrum there, a challenge for both, I think, Ms. Wrights and Mr. Graduation. So how can social protection contribute to graduation? I'm getting behind myself here. How can social protection contribute to graduation through employment? Can it, and how? Well, the theory of change we heard about is that social protection can enable recipients to overcome these kind of individual supply-side barriers to employment. Lack of skills, lack of experience, lack of resources for job search, lack of capital and assets they may need. Okay, that's fair enough. And I think the evidence is quite clear here. Transfers in public works wage, the cash transfers public works wage, can lift financial constraints to labour supply. And there's good evidence, I think, from around the world that the cash transfer does enable people to overcome these kind of financial barriers to job search and employment. And it's clear that skills training, work experience can promote the quality of labour. You have more skills, you have more to offer in the labour market. And I think we see there is greater job search, in fact, a significant growth in labour market participation from social protection participants. And something which you've seen, I think, in the BRAC programme and elsewhere, is people exiting from that very bottom segment of the labour market. If they have choices, they tend to remove themselves from those kind of most exploitative segments of the labour market. And interestingly, you also see labour market withdrawal. Typically, you see children and the elderly actually taking themselves out of the labour market when there are transfers going into their households. So there are a whole set of positive employment impacts from social protection programmes. But actually, thinking back to those kind of numbers, if we're looking at poverty more generally, we can see that the major challenge is actually on the demand side. It's the fact that you've either got chronic labour demand deficits or very pronounced seasonal labour demand deficits. So there are times when people simply cannot find employment, or the employment they find is on very adverse terms. Cash transfers can play a role in addressing labour demand, it's true. There are spillover effects such as people hiring in labour using the cash transfer they receive. There's also benefits in terms of this entrepreneurialism. And that hasn't been mentioned yet, but that's often a very strong theme in graduation programs. People will become entrepreneurs. And in fact, it's a key theme sort of running through development thinking and domestic policy. People will develop their own businesses, their own employment. But the characteristic of activities and employment, self-employment, which is generated through social protection, tends to be this very small-scale survivalist micro-enterprise. So I think that's quite important to note. Clearly, public works explicitly address the labour demand challenge. You're creating additional employment, which is additional to what the market itself can offer. But in most cases, it tends to be very small-scale, highly rationed, and often only offer one-off or temporary employment opportunities. What's interesting is there are notable exceptions. The Indian Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the NREGS, that offers massive scale of employment. Something like 50 million jobs are created each year through that program. So that's one exception. The other major exception was the New Deal program implemented in the US in the 1930s. And these programs really are trying to address labour demand on a more mass scale, but they're pretty unusual. Okay, so social protection can address both supply side and demand side factors, but actually probably mostly in quite a limited way. And I think what we see is that the key determinants of social protection success in terms of labour market outcomes are, interestingly, mostly those kind of design factors which make for good social protection generally: adequate duration, reliable transfer, large-scale coverage. But there's one interesting trade-off between graduation and social protection, which is that actually you may want to target different groups, something we heard about earlier. Because if you're interested in graduation, you may want to target households as working-age poor, whereas if your primary interest is welfare, you may well be targeting households who don't have working-age members. Okay, so my last slide. It's clear that there's an aspiration that social protection can promote graduation through sustainable employment outcomes. That line is reflected throughout the literature. And I think there's plenty of evidence which says, yes, social protection can play a role in this way, but it's subject to labour demand and labour market structures, as well as individual agency. And the individual agency element is very much stressed within the BRAC kind of graduation model. And in fact, if we're looking more broadly at extreme poverty, it's more determined perhaps by structural factors. And I think that remains a challenge. And this has implications for the likelihood of graduation through these kind of programs. And I think something which is valuable to think more about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that very interesting presentation. Also raising the issue of what are we actually trying to graduate people into? Are we just kind of graduating them into insecurity, or is it actually something where they kind of go into sustainable employment, where they can maintain their level of well-being? Just before opening up for discussion, just some general observations, which are also neatly tie into another paper that Stephen and I wrote based on stakeholder perceptions on graduation in Ethiopia and Rwanda. And we looked at both the Umrenga program in Rwanda, as well as the food security program in Ethiopia, which both kind of follow a very linear process of graduation. Graduation linked more to targeting criteria in terms of graduating from one poverty category into another. But what came out was that stakeholders also, whilst supporting that linear process, did realize that it was a very complex process, that in reality maybe it is not quite as linear as it seems in the model, and that there are a range of different factors that have to be in place, which are also raised throughout the different presentations, which enable and constrain successful graduation. So, as Anna was saying earlier, at the program level, there are a couple of issues around the level of the transfer, the size of the transfer, is it delivered predictably and on time? And also, are we actually just delivering a transfer like maybe in traditional cash transfer programs that are traditional social protection programs, or are we linking these to complementary services, and are these services actually in place? Do people have access to them? And those were some serious issues that were raised in the case, particularly in Ethiopia, but also in other contexts. At the participant level, the beneficiary, like what kind of initial asset base do they have? What is the composition at the household? What are the general attitudes to graduation? Do people actually want to graduate? Or are they quite happy to actually stay in the program because that is the only regular income transfer that they have? There are all sorts of issues about the context as well that have to be taken into account. So maybe in contexts like Bangladesh, access to markets is easier. The environment might be more enabled, more conducive. Can you really translate this model to another context, like, for example, Ethiopia or Rwanda? And at the political level, we always say that we need more political support for social protection to be high on the agenda. And in both of these countries, this was very positive. There was a lot of political support for graduation programs. But sometimes this can also lead to pressure to graduate, to then actually show graduation as a success strategy, rather than actually reflecting some kind of impact on the real livelihoods on the ground of the people. So, in generally, also people came from two different camps maybe, and we had a very interesting discussion at the bar here between Mr. Graduate and Ms. Wright. And people differ in terms of where they see graduation, particularly in combination with social protection. Should the objective of social protection be graduation, or are social protection and graduation two completely different things that can exist in parallel from one another, and they might target very different groups? Maybe social protection should be for those that are labor constrained and vulnerable and just need to have that safety net they can fall back onto, whilst graduation programs can be there for households that can take advantage of these that already have a certain asset base. But is it really an either-or question? And it's very often is an ideological question, whether you think it is a right, whether it's an issue of social justice, or whether graduation is more a good strategy to have an exit strategy to make social protection financially sustainable by having an end date to it. So these are just some general thoughts, and I thank again the panel and open the floor to questions. Also, everyone who's watching online, feel free to send some questions through.